I still remember the first time I stood inside the chamber of Concord Spire. The station floated at the gravitational center of the inner galactic roots, a structure so vast that parts of it were older than some civilizations that now used it. Concord Spire had been expanded for thousands of years, ring after ring, chamber after chamber, until it became less a station and more a small artificial world dedicated entirely to diplomacy. The council chamber itself was enormous. Curved rows of seats rose in wide circles beneath a crystal dome that reflected the light of distant stars. Hundreds of delegates filled those seats, representing civilizations that had ruled sections of the galaxy for millions of years. Some of them had built empires before Earth had even developed agriculture. My name is Daniel Harker, diplomatic representative of the United Human Systems. On that day, I was the newest voice in the entire chamber. Not the youngest person, the youngest civilization. Humanity had been part of the Council of Civilizations for only 23 years. In galactic history, that meant we had arrived moments ago. Most species viewed us with mild curiosity, the way scholars might observe an unusual new organism. Interesting, perhaps. Important, no. That day the chamber felt unusually tense. At the center platform, a holographic map rotated slowly above the floor, projecting several frontier systems in sharp blue light. Across the display, red markers blinked like warning signals. Destroyed colonies, missing fleets, dead worlds. An unknown armada had appeared along the outer frontier. No recognized design, no diplomatic contact, no warning. 3 colonies had already vanished. More than 10 million civilians now lived directly in the fleet's path. The chamber erupted into debate. Ancient admirals calculated fleet movements. Strategists projected survival probabilities. Diplomats argued over priorities. Protect the population centers first. The frontier colonies must be evacuated. We cannot defend everything. Then choose what survives. From my seat among the minor delegations, I listened quietly as the galaxy's oldest civilizations tried to reduce catastrophe into mathematics. And I realized something unsettling. To them, this was not a tragedy. It was a calculation. The debate continued for nearly an hour. From my seat near the outer ring of the chamber, I watched civilizations older than recorded human history struggle with a problem that seemed brutally simple. The holographic map above the central platform shifted as new data arrived. Red indicators multiplied across the frontier systems. Every new marker meant another destroyed colony, another silent evacuation beacon, another population that would soon disappear. The enemy fleet will reach the mining belt within 40 hours, announced a tall delegate from the Tyrell Imperium. His species had ruled nearly 200 star systems for over 3 million years, and his voice carried the heavy certainty of ancient authority. We must concentrate our defense around the populated worlds. A different representative immediately objected. And abandon the frontier colonies? Those systems contain millions of workers. Millions, the Tyrell replied calmly, not billions. Murmurs spread through the chamber. The cold arithmetic of survival. Another admiral activated a new projection. Fleet formations appeared across the display like pieces on a strategic board. Our combined forces cannot defend every location, she explained. If we spread our fleets across the frontier, the enemy will destroy us system by system. So the solution, another delegate asked slowly, is to retreat? Strategic consolidation, the admiral corrected. The words were careful, measured, almost polite, but everyone in the chamber understood their meaning. Some worlds would be saved, others would be sacrificed. The mining colonies along the frontier, small settlements built to harvest rare elements from distant systems, sat directly in the path of the unknown fleet. They were too far away, too vulnerable, too expensive to protect. One by one, the ancient powers began reaching the same conclusion. Save the major population centers. Abandon the frontier. A quiet silence settled across the chamber as the reality became unavoidable. More than 10 million civilians lived in those colonies. Families, workers, Children who had never even seen the central worlds they were now being asked to die for. The council had faced wars before, but rarely a decision this stark. Across the chamber, delegates studied the tactical projections in uneasy silence. Some looked angry, some looked ashamed, most simply looked tired. This was the burden of ancient civilizations. They had learned long ago that survival sometimes demanded terrible choices. From my seat among the younger species, I watched them debate the fate of entire worlds. And slowly, I began to understand something about the galaxy. Experience did not make them cruel. It made them practical. Too practical, because once a civilization had lived long enough, even tragedy could begin to look like statistics. For a long time, I said nothing. Humanity had learned very quickly how the council worked. Older civilizations dominated the discussions. Their fleets were larger, their economies older, their experience far greater than ours. When crises emerged, the galaxy listened to them first. Younger species usually observed, so I watched the debate continue. Delegates discussed evacuation corridors. Admirals argued about defensive formations. Analysts projected casualty estimates with unsettling precision. Numbers moved across the holographic map. 10 million civilians, then 9 million, then 8. Each new estimate meant fewer survivors. Eventually the Speaker of the Council raised one of his thin arms and the chamber gradually quieted. His species, the Varani, had served as neutral moderators for thousands of years. Their calm authority usually ended disputes before they grew violent. The Council must decide, he said. His voice carried across the vast chamber without effort. We do not possess the fleet strength to defend every system in the frontier region. The enemy's speed and unknown capabilities make a distributed defense impossible. The holographic map shifted again. Two sets of defensive lines appeared. One protected the large populated worlds. The other protected the mining colonies. The difference between them was obvious. If the fleets defended the core worlds, the colonies would be lost. If the fleets defended the frontier colonies, the core worlds would become vulnerable. We must choose, the speaker continued quietly. Which lives we attempt to save? No one spoke for several seconds. Across the chamber, ancient delegates studied the projection with expressions that had learned to hide emotion behind diplomacy. To them, this was not the first time such a choice had appeared. Empires survived by making decisions like this. Finally the Tyrell delegate stood again. The decision is unfortunate, he said. But the survival of the greater population must take priority. We should concentrate our fleets around the major worlds. Several other civilizations signaled agreement. The logic was clear. Protect billions, lose millions. From a purely strategic perspective, it was the only rational choice. I understood their reasoning. I truly did. But as I listened to them calmly discuss the abandonment of entire colonies, something inside me refused to stay silent. I stood. My chair slid quietly backward against the polished floor. For a moment, no one noticed. Then a few nearby delegates turned their heads. A human delegate standing during a strategic council session was unusual. The speaker looked toward me with mild curiosity. The chair recognizes the representative from Earth, he said. Hundreds of alien eyes turned in my direction. And for the first time since joining the council, humanity finally had the floor. For several seconds, the chamber remained silent. Hundreds of alien eyes studied me with mild curiosity, as if the council had just granted the floor to an unexpected participant in a discussion far above his experience. I understood why. Humanity had joined the council only recently. We possessed a small fleet, modest territory, and very little political influence. When ancient civilizations debated war, human delegates were usually observers rather than contributors. But the speaker had recognized me, which meant I had to speak. I stepped forward slightly so my voice would carry through the chamber. I have been listening to the discussion, I said calmly. And it seems the council has reached an unfortunate conclusion. A few delegates shifted in their seats. You believe you must choose between the core worlds and the frontier colonies. No one argued. Because that was exactly the situation. The numbers are clear, I continued. Billions of civilians live on the central worlds. The mining colonies hold only millions. Protecting the larger population is the logical decision. Several delegates nodded. One of the ancient admirals leaned back slightly, clearly expecting the human representative to support the strategic consensus. Instead, I said something else. Sometimes numbers are not the answer. The chamber grew quiet again. Sometimes, I continued, choosing my words carefully, a single action can change the entire situation. The Tyrell delegate frowned slightly. Human representative, he said, we appreciate your attempt to contribute. But this situation requires fleets, logistics, and strategic positioning. Philosophy will not stop an unknown armada. I agree, I said. This is not philosophy. Several delegates exchanged curious looks. The Varani speaker leaned forward slightly. Then perhaps, he said gently, you would clarify your meaning. I paused for a moment. Not because I was unsure, but because I knew how strange the words would sound in this chamber full of ancient strategists. Sometimes, I said, the solution is not in numbers. I gestured toward the holographic map above the chamber floor. Sometimes a simple act can change the course of events. Silence spread across the chamber. Not agreement, not understanding, just confusion. To the ancient civilizations of the galaxy, war was a matter of fleets and probabilities. What I had just suggested sounded irrational, and the reaction came exactly as I expected. The silence lasted only a moment. Then the laughter began. It started quietly, one delegate releasing a low clicking sound that served as amusement for his species. Another emitted a soft rumbling noise. Soon the reaction spread through the chamber in waves. Some laughed openly, others simply shook their heads. To them, the human representative had just suggested that a war could be influenced by something other than fleets and mathematics. The Tyrell delegate spoke first. Young civilizations often believe the universe rewards noble gestures, he said, his voice patient in the way elders address children. But the galaxy does not function that way. A tall admiral from the Cathari fleets added dryly, kindness has never stopped an invasion force. Several other delegates signaled agreement. The chamber gradually returned to its earlier atmosphere of cold calculation. Numbers reappeared across the tactical display. Fleet routes shifted as new defensive proposals were considered. The conversation resumed exactly where it had been before I stood. The frontier colonies were still being abandoned. The council had already accepted the decision. I remained standing for a few seconds longer, watching the discussion move forward without me. No one expected humanity to change anything. Why would they? Compared to the ancient civilizations of the council, we were barely more than newcomers exploring our first steps among the stars. We had no legendary fleets, no thousands of years of strategic tradition, no great political alliances, just a young civilization trying to survive in a galaxy full of older powers. Eventually I returned to my seat. The speaker glanced in my direction with polite neutrality before allowing the debate to continue. No one asked the human delegation for further input. And that was fine, because the council chamber was not where the real story was about to happen. Far from Concord Spire, beyond the central trade routes and the diplomatic arguments of ancient civilizations, life continued quietly on thousands of ordinary stations. Most of the galaxy had never even heard of the debate that day. One of those places was a small orbital maintenance platform called Horizon 9. It was an unimportant station orbiting an unimportant system. No admirals worked there. No ambassadors visited. No great decisions of galactic history had ever been made there. Which is why the person who was about to change everything worked there without anyone noticing. His name was Lucas Reed. And at that exact moment, he was sitting alone on a metal bench, eating lunch and watching ships come and go in the docking bay. Horizon 9 was not the kind of station that appeared in council briefings. It orbited a quiet trade route far from the political centers of the galaxy, a functional ring of metal and glass built to service cargo ships moving between the frontier systems. Most travelers stayed only long enough to refuel, repair something small, and leave again. Nothing important ever happened there, which was exactly why Lucas Reed liked it. I learned about him later, of course, when the story spread across half the galaxy. At the time he was simply one more human worker assigned to a maintenance rotation most diplomats would never even hear about. Lucas was not a soldier. He was not a scientist or an engineer with prestigious degrees. His official title was Maintenance Technician Third Class, which meant he spent most of his time fixing things that broke when nobody else felt like dealing with them. Air recyclers, door mechanisms, cooling pipes, anything on the station that rattled, leaked, or refused to work properly eventually ended up on Lucas's work schedule. The job was quiet, repetitive, and, in his opinion, perfectly fine. Every day followed roughly the same rhythm. Lucas woke early in the crew quarters, drank terrible station coffee, and spent several hours crawling through maintenance corridors repairing whatever problem the station computer had assigned him that morning. Around midday he took his lunch break. Not in the crowded cafeteria. Lucas preferred a particular bench in one of the observation corridors overlooking the main docking bay. From there he could watch freighters drift slowly into their assigned ports while small service drones floated around them like patient insects. It was peaceful. The bench stood beside a wide reinforced window that framed the stars and the constant movement of arriving ships. Lucas usually brought something simple for lunch: a sandwich, fruit, sometimes rice or noodles packed in a small container. Nothing fancy, just enough food to sit quietly for 20 minutes while he watched the slow traffic of the station. Most days he ate alone. Workers passed through occasionally, but Horizon 9 was not a place where strangers started long conversations. People had schedules, shipments, responsibilities. They came and went. Lucas didn't mind the silence. It was part of the job. On the day everything changed, he was sitting on that same bench, unwrapping a sandwich and looking out across the docking bay while a heavy cargo freighter slowly rotated toward its assigned port. He had just taken the first bite when someone sat down on the far end of the bench. Lucas glanced over automatically. The woman looked exhausted. Lucas noticed her immediately, not because of what she looked like, but because of how she moved. Most travelers on Horizon 9 carried the same rhythm: hurried steps, tired glances at their data pads, the quiet impatience of people who wanted to finish their business and leave the station behind. This woman moved differently, slowly, carefully, like someone who had been awake for far too long and was no longer certain where she was supposed to go next. She sat at the far end of the bench without speaking. Her posture was straight, but the tension in her shoulders suggested exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical travel. Lucas took another bite of his sandwich and watched the docking bay for a moment before glancing back at her. She was clearly not human. Her features were subtle and elegant, with pale skin that carried a faint silver tone beneath the corridor lighting. Dark hair fell loosely over one shoulder, and her eyes, when she briefly looked toward the window, seemed distant, focused on something far beyond the ships drifting outside. Lucas had seen many alien species during his time on the station. Freighters passed through from dozens of systems. Still, something about this traveler stood out. Not power, not authority, just weight, the kind of quiet heaviness someone carried after making decisions that did not leave room for sleep. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Lucas finished half his sandwich while the station's traffic control guided another transport vessel into the docking ring. The soft mechanical voice of the system echoed faintly through the corridor. The woman remained silent. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, but Lucas noticed that her fingers occasionally tightened slightly, as if she were replaying something unpleasant in her thoughts. Finally he looked at the sandwich in his hand, then at her, then back at the sandwich. "Hey," he said casually. The woman turned her head. Lucas broke the sandwich in half and held one piece out toward her. "You look like you haven't eaten," he said. For a moment she didn't respond. Not refusal, just surprise. Lucas realized she was studying him with quiet confusion, as if trying to understand whether the offer was serious. He shrugged slightly. It's nothing special, he added. Just station bread and synthetic turkey. But it's better than the cafeteria noodles. Another few seconds passed. Then, slowly, she reached out and accepted the half of the sandwich. Thank you, she said softly. Her voice carried a faint accent Lucas didn't recognize. He nodded once and leaned back against the bench again, returning his attention to the ships outside the window. No ceremony, no questions, just two strangers sitting quietly on a station bench, sharing lunch while cargo freighters drifted through the stars. Lucas expected the woman to leave after a few minutes. Most travelers on Horizon 9 did. They stopped briefly, rested, and then continued toward their ships or assignments. The station was not a place where strangers stayed long enough to form routines. But the next day, when Lucas returned to the observation corridor with his lunch, she was already there. Sitting on the same bench, looking out at the docking bay. He slowed slightly when he saw her, unsure whether it was coincidence or intention. She noticed him approaching and gave a small nod of recognition. Lucas nodded back and sat in his usual place. For a while they watched the ships in silence. Then he opened his lunch container. Inside were two sandwiches. He held one out without saying anything. She accepted it this time without hesitation. Thank you, she said again. Lucas shrugged lightly. Brought an extra just in case. The woman studied him for a moment before taking a small bite. She seemed thoughtful, as if trying to understand the quiet simplicity of the gesture. What is your name? She asked. Lucas, he replied. Lucas Reed. She nodded slowly. Mira. The name sounded short and unfamiliar, but Lucas didn't question it. Horizon 9 saw visitors from dozens of worlds every week. Unusual names were normal. After that, the conversations began. Not important conversations. Lucas talked about ordinary things. About rain on Earth and how it smelled on warm pavement after a summer storm. About oceans and the strange calm that came from watching waves move endlessly toward the shore. About fruit markets in coastal cities where the air smelled like oranges and salt. Mira listened carefully. Sometimes she asked small questions. What does the ocean sound like? What does rain feel like on your skin? Lucas answered without thinking too deeply about it. It's loud, he said once. But in a peaceful way. Like the planet breathing. Day after day she returned to the bench. Lucas began bringing extra food without mentioning it. Rice bowls, fruit, sandwiches. They spoke about simple things that had nothing to do with politics or war. Yet occasionally Mira asked unusual questions. Questions that felt heavier than the quiet corridor around them. One afternoon she looked at him and asked softly, "Why did you help me that first day?" Lucas thought about it for a moment. Then he gave the only honest answer he had. "You looked lonely," he said. Mira was silent after that. For the first time since Lucas had met her, her eyes lowered slightly, as if that simple explanation carried more weight than she expected. By the second week, their meetings had become routine. Lucas would finish his morning repairs, wash the grease from his hands in the maintenance sink, and head toward the observation corridor with a small lunch container. And almost every day, Mira was already there. She always sat in the same place on the bench, facing the large window that overlooked the docking bay. Ships arrived and departed behind the transparent shield, their engines glowing faintly as they maneuvered through the station's traffic lanes. Lucas would sit beside her. They would eat. They would talk. Nothing about the routine felt unusual to him. But to Mira, those quiet lunches were something she had not experienced in many years. One afternoon the docking bay was unusually busy. 3 cargo freighters were docking at once, guided carefully by the station's automated systems. The slow movements of the massive ships filled the window like drifting cities. Lucas handed Mira a container filled with rice and vegetables. She accepted it quietly. For several minutes they ate in silence. Then Mira spoke. "Lucas," she said softly, "have you ever made a decision that hurt people?" Lucas paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "That's kind of a heavy question for lunch," he said. Mira did not smile. "I am serious." Lucas leaned back slightly, thinking. I guess everyone does at some point, he said eventually. Even small choices can hurt someone. Mira looked down at the food in her hands. What if the decision saved millions of lives? She asked slowly, but destroyed a smaller group. Lucas did not answer immediately. Outside the window, one of the freighters slowly rotated into position while docking clamps extended to meet it. Finally he spoke. That sounds like the kind of problem politicians deal with. And if the decision was yours? She asked. Lucas shrugged slightly. I'd probably hate it. Mira looked at him. Even if it was the correct choice? Lucas nodded. Yeah. He took another bite of his food before continuing. Doing the right thing doesn't mean it feels good. The words hung quietly between them. Myra's hands tightened slightly around the container. For the first time since she had started visiting the bench, Lucas saw something shift in her expression. A crack in the calm composure she carried. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I saved 12 million people, she said. Lucas blinked, but a colony was destroyed because of that decision. Her eyes remained fixed on the window. I expected someone to tell me it was the correct choice. Lucas studied her for a moment. Then he said something very simple. If it hurts you, he said quietly, then your heart still works. For a moment neither of them moved. Outside the window, a transport vessel slowly drifted away from the station, its engines glowing faintly blue as it cleared the docking perimeter. The soft hum of Horizon 9 systems filled the quiet corridor. Myra's hands trembled slightly. Lucas noticed. Then, slowly, the composure she had carried for days finally broke. Tears slid down her face. Not loud sobbing, not dramatic grief, just silent tears from someone who had carried the weight of a decision alone for far too long. Lucas didn't panic. He simply sat there, giving her time. Eventually she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and tried to regain the calm expression she usually wore. I have not cried in many years, she said quietly. Lucas shrugged a little. Probably overdue. That answer surprised her enough that a faint smile appeared. For several minutes they sat together in silence again. Then footsteps echoed in the corridor behind them. Lucas glanced over his shoulder. 4 tall figures had entered the observation hall. They were armored, not station security, something far more formal. Their armor was dark and polished, marked with insignia Lucas did not recognize. Each one carried the posture of someone trained to protect something extremely important. They stopped several meters behind the bench. Then, in perfect unison, they dropped to one knee. Lucas blinked. He said slowly. The soldiers lowered their heads. One of them spoke. Your Majesty, the fleet is ready. Lucas turned his head toward Mira. She had gone completely still. For a few seconds she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different, calm, controlled, carrying an authority Lucas had never heard before. Stand. The soldiers immediately rose. Lucas stared at them. Then he looked back at the woman beside him. Your Majesty? He repeated. Mira exhaled slowly. The quiet traveler who had shared sandwiches with him for 2 weeks straightened slightly. The exhaustion was still there. But now Lucas saw something else beneath it. Power. Responsibility. The kind of presence that made trained soldiers kneel without hesitation. I suppose, she said gently, I owe you an explanation. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, he admitted. That would probably help. Mira turned toward him fully now. I am Mira Valen, she said. Empress of the Galactic Union. Lucas stared at her. Then he looked at the armored guards. Then back at her again. The silence lasted several seconds. Finally he asked the first question that came to mind. So, did you actually like the sandwich? For the first time in many years, the Empress of the Galactic Union laughed. Lucas had never been particularly interested in galactic politics. Before that afternoon on the bench, the largest authority figure he had ever spoken to was the shift supervisor who occasionally reminded him to finish maintenance reports on time. Now he was sitting beside the Empress of the Galactic Union. He stared at her for several seconds, trying to decide if the situation was real or if he had somehow inhaled too many chemical fumes while fixing an air recycler earlier that morning. The armored guards standing behind them looked extremely real. Lucas sighed. Well, he said slowly, that's new. Mira. No, the Empress, watched him with quiet curiosity. Most people reacted to her title with fear or formal obedience. Entire planetary governments changed their tone the moment she entered a room. Lucas Reed simply leaned back on the bench. You could have mentioned that earlier, he added. I did not come here as an empress, she replied calmly. That's probably good, Lucas said. I would have brought a better sandwich. One of the guards behind them made a small sound that might have been a suppressed cough. Myra's faint smile returned. My journey here was not meant to be known, she explained. I needed to see something without influence or ceremony. Lucas tilted his head slightly. See what? She looked out through the window again, watching another freighter drift slowly away from the station. For many years the Union has debated whether humanity can be trusted, she said. Lucas blinked. That seems like a weird thing to test with sandwiches. You did not know who I was, she replied. Exactly. He thought about that for a moment. Then shrugged. Still seemed like someone who hadn't eaten. The Empress studied him quietly. You offered help with no expectation of reward. Lucas gave a small laugh. It was half a sandwich. Yes, she said softly. Exactly. In the following weeks, the story began spreading quietly across the galaxy. Not through official announcements, through whispers, through private diplomatic messages, through soldiers who had witnessed their empress kneel beside an ordinary bench on an unimportant station. The Empress of the Galactic Union had gone into hiding to find an answer. And she had found it not in fleets, negotiations, or strategic simulations. She had found it in a forgotten corridor on Horizon 9. Because a human maintenance technician saw a tired stranger sitting alone, and simply shared his lunch. The story moved through the galaxy faster than any official declaration ever could. Diplomats whispered about it during closed council sessions. Military officers repeated it quietly in briefing rooms. Even merchants along distant trade routes began retelling the strange rumor that had started on a forgotten maintenance station. The Empress of the Galactic Union had gone into hiding, and a human had fed her lunch. Most species expected something dramatic to follow. Political demands, new treaties, perhaps an alliance announcement or a military pact between the Union and the young human civilization. Instead, the response from Earth was simple. Several weeks after the story reached Concord Spire, the Council of Civilizations requested clarification from the human delegation. Rumors were spreading too widely to ignore, and the older species preferred certainty over speculation. The council chamber filled again. I was there when the speaker called for the human ambassador. Ambassador Elena Park stepped forward onto the central platform. Unlike the grand robes worn by some diplomats, she wore a simple dark uniform that looked almost plain compared to the ceremonial clothing of the older civilizations. The chamber was quieter than usual. Everyone had heard the story. Everyone wanted to know what humanity would ask in return. The speaker spoke first. The Council understands that the Empress of the Galactic Union recently completed a private journey through several frontier systems, he said carefully. And that during this journey she encountered a human citizen who offered assistance. Murmurs moved through the chamber. The speaker continued. Several members of the Council have expressed curiosity regarding humanity's intentions following this unusual event. Ambassador Park listened patiently. When the speaker finished, she nodded once and stepped forward. Her voice was calm, measured. We are aware that the story has attracted attention, she said. That is understandable. The holographic ceiling above the chamber reflected the slow movement of distant stars while hundreds of alien representatives waited for the inevitable diplomatic request. Territory, trade advantages, military alliances. That was how galactic politics usually worked. Ambassador Park folded her hands behind her back. Humanity is grateful that the Empress returned safely, she continued. But we do not intend to request anything. A wave of confusion passed through the chamber. The Tyrell delegate leaned forward slightly. You ask for no compensation? He said. No political advantage? Park shook her head gently. The human who helped her did not know who she was. Then why did he help? Another delegate asked. The ambassador smiled faintly. Because she looked like someone who needed help. Silence filled the chamber. Then Ambassador Park spoke the words that would later be recorded in dozens of historical archives across the galaxy. We may not always be the strongest civilization, she said. But we will always try to help. Lucas Reed expected life to return to normal. For a few days after the truth was revealed, Horizon 9 was anything but quiet. Station administrators suddenly discovered they cared very much about maintenance corridors. Security teams appeared where none had existed before. Someone from the Union government interviewed Lucas for nearly 3 hours and asked questions that made him feel as if he had accidentally stepped into a diplomatic incident. But eventually the excitement faded. Cargo ships continued arriving. Pipes continued leaking. Air recyclers continued breaking at inconvenient times. Lucas returned to his normal routine. In many ways nothing had changed. Except that occasionally, when travelers passed through the station, some of them looked at him with a strange expression, half curiosity, half disbelief. He ignored it. Lucas had never been comfortable with attention. Nearly a month after Mira left the station, Lucas finished repairing a faulty cooling valve in docking corridor C. He wiped grease from his hands and headed toward his quarters when the station terminal beside the hallway door chimed softly. Message for technician Lucas Reed. Lucas frowned slightly. Maintenance workers rarely received personal messages through the main station system. He tapped the screen. A sealed diplomatic transmission opened across the display. The symbol at the top made Lucas pause. It was the crest of the Galactic Union. The message itself was brief. Lucas Reed, your assistance during my recent journey was appreciated more than you may realize. If your schedule allows, I would be honored if you visited the world of Elra next month. There is a place in the Imperial Gardens where I believe you might enjoy lunch. You may bring sandwiches if you wish. Mira. Lucas stared at the message for a long moment. Then he laughed quietly to himself. Well, he said to the empty corridor. That's not something you see every day. 3 weeks later, a small diplomatic shuttle landed on the emerald world of Elra. Lucas stepped out onto a landing platform surrounded by enormous gardens filled with trees from dozens of star systems. The air smelled like flowers and fresh rain. At the center of the garden stood a simple stone bench beneath a wide silver tree. And sitting there, waiting patiently, was the Empress of the Galactic Union. The gardens of Elra were quiet. Tall silver trees moved gently in the warm wind, their leaves reflecting sunlight like scattered pieces of glass. Streams of clear water flowed through carefully shaped stone channels, and distant birds filled the air with soft, unfamiliar songs. Lucas followed the garden path slowly, trying not to stare at the enormous palace rising beyond the trees. He had never been anywhere like this. At the center of the garden stood the stone bench mentioned in the message. Mira was already there. She wore simple clothing again, nothing like the ceremonial robes Lucas had seen briefly when the guards revealed who she truly was. In the quiet garden she looked much closer to the traveler who had once sat beside him on a metal bench on Horizon 9. She looked up as Lucas approached. You came, she said. Lucas shrugged lightly. You invited me to lunch. He lifted a small bag he had been carrying. And I brought sandwiches. For the first time since becoming Empress, Mira Valen laughed the same way she had on the station. Lucas sat beside her on the bench. For a while they simply ate and watched the gardens. No guards stood close enough to hear them. No diplomats waited nearby. The galaxy's politics remained far away beyond the trees. After some time Mira spoke quietly. I built this bench after returning from my journey, she said. Lucas looked around the peaceful garden. Why? She thought about the answer for a moment. Because sometimes the galaxy forgets simple things. Lucas nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. Then he handed her half of a sandwich. And once again, two people sat quietly on a bench, sharing lunch beneath the open sky.